Hello, I'd like to introduce myself and the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years. My name is Deborah Barnett, although you can call me Deb, and I am a qualified social worker, a qualified teacher. I'm qualified to practice as an expert witness in court in cases of equality and diversity. I am an author of 2 published safeguarding books and a number of articles, and I do a lot of consultancy work, domestic homicide reviews, safeguarding adults reviews, complaints, inquiries, and over the past few years I have developed a passion for trauma-informed and strength-based service provision. And I think this is something that's massively going to help services in the future. This interest began with a case of hoarding, person hoarding and self-neglecting, and I realised that people were going around in circles with this case. So I wanted to find some solutions, and I'm delighted to say that over the past 3 years, a psychology colleague and I have worked with lots and lots of people who have hoarding disorder, and we have had 100% safeguarding success with all of those people, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we began. And I think the first thing is forget about the hoarding and the self-neglect. It's a red herring. What we need to be is more trauma informed. In other words, we need to be looking for, are there signs of trauma in this person? Trauma, neglect, loss, bereavement. So have a think for a few minutes about what those kinds of things might be. On the slide you'll see things like anger, fear, anxiety, rage, terror, insomnia, a feeling of hopelessness, disassociated from people, isolation. I think that some of these may sound very familiar in cases of hoarding. So we've already got a number of triggers that suggest that this might be something associated with trauma. In fact, if you look at the diagnostic criteria for trauma, you will see that the criteria presented by the person, the indicators presented by the person, almost always do reflect those kinds of post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms. Now, there are exceptions to that, and some of those exceptions might be somebody, for example, with a physical disability who just can't manage to look after the house, or somebody with a short-term mental health problem where they're not managing their mental health very well and therefore they're not managing their house. This is very different to somebody who has a long-term ongoing issue that kind of resists services, that presents blockages. So for those people who might just have a disability or mental health problem and obviously they need some support, that would come in the form of an assessment and a care plan to be able to provide that support to them. So we're going to predominantly talk about all of those other people where there's indicators that there might be something traumatic happened to them. And I can't explain it any more simplistically and easily than Scotland have in their initiatives in trauma-informed services. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a video so that you can get an idea about what trauma-informed services are to begin with.
Whenever Mum went away, he would come into my room. He said I made him do it, and that it meant he loved me. It always made me feel powerless, ashamed.
I never knew when an argument would turn into a fight. I was always scared, always on edge, always had to be ready to defend myself.
My late husband was very controlling. always put me down, told me what to wear or cook. He'd get angry if I didn't do things right. I had no choice or control. It made me feel useless. I had no confidence in the end.
So I zoned out, pretended it wasn't happening. It's so difficult to trust people now. I just freeze and float away in my head when I feel powerless.
Now I just get angry a lot, feel like I want to fight. Sometimes I worry I'm just like him.
I find it difficult to do things myself, and I get really nervous when I have to talk to new people. I avoid them when I can.
What we went through was traumatic because we were harmed, physically, emotionally, and felt like we were in real danger.
Traumatic experiences can be things that happen once, like a serious accident or assault.
Or it can be where traumatic things keep happening, like physical or sexual childhood abuse, or domestic abuse, or relationships where you can't be yourself, where you're put down or bullied.
It can make you feel powerless, trapped, or betrayed. The sense of confusion, shame, or fear can be overwhelming, especially if there is no one you feel able to tell. Even after it's over, it's harder to get on with life and feel safe.
Trauma is more common than most people think. Almost 1 in 5 adults has experienced physical or sexual abuse in their childhood.
And more than a quarter of all women have experienced domestic abuse.
Some people recover after traumatic events. Some people aren't affected as much. Having good, safe, supportive relationships with other people can really help. But lots of people continue to be affected by trauma, sometimes long after it happened.
For most of us, traumatic or adverse childhood experiences like these affect our body's response to stress, affecting our physical health as well as our mental health. The impact of trauma can also make it harder for us to learn and to realise our full potential.
One of the most worrying things about the experience of trauma is that it can make us avoid people and places, even if they are there to help, like doctors, teachers, social workers, carers, colleges.
Councils, community centres, employers, advisors. Because most trauma experiences happen in relationships with other people, we can find it difficult to trust people or feel safe. And sometimes the way we react to help ourselves feel safe pushes people away and makes it even harder to get the help we need.
It's like our brains learn survival tricks to get us through the trauma at the time, like priming us for danger.
Making us run away.
Shutting down when we feel upset.
It might look like we have a short fuse, like we're unfriendly, or we're just a bit absent.
Anything, however small, that reminds us of that trauma can set off our own unique trauma response to protect ourselves, making us avoid the people and places that we need the most. Like you. But there are things you can do to help me trust you enough so I feel safe and I don't shut down or avoid you. You can offer me a different relationship that doesn't remind me of the one I had when I was a kid. One where I feel safe, I feel empowered, and I have choice and control over what happens to me. One where we work together and I can trust you. This is called being trauma-informed in the way you work.
Being trauma-informed means thinking about what will make me feel safe. It might mean offering me choice over the sex of the person offering me care or support, especially if it involves intimate care or examinations.
Unfortunately, your usual care worker Heather's off sick. We'll be sending someone else instead. Do you have any preferences about who comes instead?
Well, I'd feel more comfortable with someone I've met before. Most importantly, I'd like a woman.
Well, how about June? She's worked with us for 3 years. If there's anything you'd like her to do that Heather normally does, just ask.
Trauma-informed means empowering me to have control and take an active role in what happens to me.
We know some people don't like coming to the dentist, so is there anything that you're worried about or scared of? I can tell you each step I'm doing so there are no surprises if you'd like. If you need me to stop, how will you tell me?
Trauma-informed means helping me to trust you by being clear about what will happen, doing what you say you will do when you said you would do it.
Unfortunately, our advisors are running about 30 minutes late. I'm so sorry about that. Are you able to stay, or can we make another appointment for you?
Many of us at work will have had our own experiences of trauma in our own lives, or we might witness or hear about it in the course of our work. So the same principles apply to all of us. We all need to take care of ourselves by making sure we're safe and connected to the people and activities that matter to us. Can you think of anyone you've met or worked with recently that a trauma-informed approach would have made a difference to? Are there any trauma-informed changes you might make that could make a difference?
So if you offer me safety and choice, if you collaborate with me and empower me and help me trust you, then you will help me work with you. Even if I only meet you once, even briefly, you can give me a different kind of relationship. One where I feel valued and valuable, connected and safe.
And when that happens over and over again with everyone that I meet, I can learn that it's safe to make connections with people.
It is those connections that we all need to access life chances and reach our full potential.
So, to be trauma-informed, we need to ask ourselves a number of questions, such as, is the person in front of us chaotic or disorganised? Could they get irritated or angry on occasions? Have you noticed that the person might be quite jumpy or that their startled responses appear exaggerated? Do they sometimes feel as if they're quite fatalistic, kind of predetermining the end of their days being shorter lived than others, that will not live very long? Does a person have difficulty sleeping? And when they do sleep, do they regularly suffer from nightmares? Is the person quite sensory aware? Do they describe things in terms of texture, smell, taste, sounds, or the details in things? Does the person display increased anxiety, which can lead to things like exhaustion? Can the person appear maybe paranoid at times about specific things or specific issues? Does the person, perhaps some people might use drugs or substances or food or self-neglect or self-harm to manage some of those feelings? It doesn't have to be there, but it's a consideration. Does the person act quite impulsively? Does the person seem to lose time or forget what happened for periods of time? And is the person looking out for threats to themselves and or their property? Well, this, largely speaking, is a diagnostic criteria for trauma. And if you're answering yes to a number of these issues, then you have to start really looking into the possibility that this person, at some point or a number of points in their life, might have been affected by trauma. Some of the traumatic experiences that we might want to consider are things like, well, there's a number, community violence, so at some point have they been subject to predatory violence, including robberies, shootings, rapes, beatings, gang fights, stabbings, or other conflicts between people. domestic abuse, an incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour or violence between those aged 16 or over, and that can be intimate partners or family members regardless of gender or sexual orientation, sexual identity. That can include things like forced marriage, honour-based crime, female genital mutilation, psychological, physical, sexual, financial, emotional abuse. So in other words, most safeguarding issues within the community, if somebody has experienced abuse or neglect within a family environment, then that would also fall under domestic abuse. We've mentioned all of the physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, organisational abuse, financial abuse. Obviously there's lots of scamming issues at the moment, trafficking and modern day slavery, sexual exploitation, natural or man-made disasters, war, terrorism, political violence, grief or separation, or even it may be that somebody's been quite a strong person, had a sound career, and then they've lost the ability to, say for example, communicate or to hear or to see, or some physical disability has caused them to have a trauma response because they're no longer in the same position as they used to be. So once we've recognised trauma, then we start to see the symptoms of self-neglect and hoarding as being a symptom of trauma. So if somebody presents as chaotic, disorganised, irritable, angry, unable to engage with people, they act impulsively, collecting things, they're hyper-vigilant, they may then be chaotic, self-neglecting and hoard. It might be worth exploring whether this is part of a trauma response. And a psychology-led approach is much better than perhaps re-traumatizing a person by talking about the trauma itself. The person might have fear of engaging as a result of the symptoms of trauma. One of the issues of that is that there are a number of therapies that people have in response to traumatic events, and one of them often is cognitive behavioural therapy and exposure therapies. Now, this can actually cause re-traumatization. Traumatic stress has little to do with cognition or how people perceive things to be. It's the brain's defense mechanism. It rewires the processes to make the person alert to danger and refuses them to consider other things. Maybe they're constantly in survival mode, so that's why their senses are aware. But in that part of the brain that is used, we don't have a chronology. We act impulsively in response to danger, and therefore that presents difficulties over a long period of time for the person. So when somebody is subject to trauma, what we're saying is that they go into trauma mode. So fight, flight, freeze, flop or friend. And whilst a person's in this mode, their body, brain in the hippocampus and the amygdala area presents a trauma response. So it makes them hyper-vigilant to sight, sound, smell, texture and taste. And in this part of the brain, there's no past and there's no future. It's all happening now. The problem with that is that the hippocampus normally transfers memories into the past to say, oh, that happened in the past. But when we're in trauma mode, when we're ready to respond, and that goes a bit faulty and remains with us, we constantly feel like we're in trauma mode. And therefore, it doesn't go into the part of the brain that is part of the executive function of the brain. And the executive function of the brain that tells us what order things happen, the chronology. It's the bit of the brain that tells us how to care for ourselves, to control our impulses, to transfer memories to long-term memories. And it also affects our perception of risk and our personal identity. So when you see somebody who's hoarding and self-neglecting and their self-care has been affected, they're impulsively collecting things, they're attached to things that have sensory feelings, and they're bringing things in and they're loving animals or objects, they've transferred that attachment from people to their belongings, then what we're doing is actually we're recognising that this person is responding to trauma. Now, can you imagine how horrendous that might be for that person when every coping strategy to save them from a horrendous traumatic incident that feels like it's happening right now is taken away, when somebody clears their belongings from the house, when somebody prevents them from using those coping mechanisms without first addressing the trauma and supporting them to move on from the trauma feelings and helping them to recognise that that trauma is in the past. If that trauma is felt now, every dream that they have related to that trauma, every sensory experience that triggers that trauma is telling them that it's now, and you're removing every coping strategy. So to be trauma informed means that we recognise that we shouldn't be doing that. It means that we recognise that we have to give control and power back to the person. It means that we recognise how to work with that person without blaming them further for the abuse that they originally suffered, without labelling them as somebody who's defective, by saying this is a result of this abuse, this is the trauma that you've suffered, and we can support you with that. Once we support with the trauma, the door is open. The person themselves will want to address the symptoms of trauma. They'll want to move on. That's what happens when we address the trauma. Now, in reality, trauma doesn't just affect us in the fact that we would self-neglect or hoard. It can also affect people so that they become homeless, so that they become a victim again because they're presenting as vulnerable, so that they have horrendous experiences that happen over and over again because of those defense mechanisms that they're displaying to the world.